They didn't whisper it. They said it right to her face. And the words were sharper than broken glass. Too fat to be anyone's wife. That ain't a woman, that's a wagon. No man with eyes would want that lump of lard. Her name was Ida Mae Coburn, and she was 52 years old. In a dusty, forgotten town that stank of sweat, whiskey, and regret, she stood on a saloon stage. The flickering lamplight wasn't kind. It carved shadows into the lines on her face, lines etched by hunger and humiliation. A number was slapped on her back, a crude cattle tag marking her for what she was, property. The bidding began, not for marriage, not for a helping hand. It was for sport, a cruel joke to pass a Tuesday afternoon. "Sold to the pig pen," one man shouted, and the room roared with laughter. Another man, face flushed with cheap liquor, tossed a coin onto the stage. "A penny for the sow, and that's being generous." Ida stood still. Her face was stone, a mask she'd perfected over a lifetime of being told she was a burden. But inside, her soul was crumbling, turning to dust and scattering in the wind. When the world calls you worthless every single day, a part of you eventually stops fighting. A part of you starts to believe it. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a stained vest, raised his gavel. The laughter hit its peak, a wave of pure cruelty ready to crash down on her. And that's when he stepped forward. From the back of the room, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. He was a tall man in dust-worn boots, with quiet eyes that had seen enough pain to recognize it in an instant. He didn't shout. He didn't push. He just moved through the crowd, and the sea of mockery parted before him. He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up. He didn't look at her size. He didn't look at the number on her back. He looked at her, straight into her eyes. And for the first time in what felt like a century, Etta felt like a person, not an object. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a razor. $10, he said, calm, clear. "And you will not call her that again?" The room went dead silent. You could have heard a feather drop. The laughter died in their throats. All that cruelty, so confident just a moment before, was now replaced with stunned confusion. $10 was a fortune. It was more than the horse tied up outside was worth. Why would a man like that, a stranger, fight for a woman everyone else had thrown away? What did he see that no one else did? This isn't just a story about a rescue. It's a story about a debt, a hidden secret, and a town built on a lie so dark it was about to swallow them all. Stay with us, because what happened next, no one saw coming. The silence in that saloon was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in water. Every eye was on the tall stranger. Calder Reese. The name was whispered from the corners of the room. He was a rancher from the hills, a man who kept to himself, a widower. He came to town for horse feed, not for trouble, but he had found it. Or maybe it had found him. He laid a stack of worn bills on the auctioneer's block. The money was real. The offer was real. The sheriff who had organized this whole disgusting affair shifted on his feet. He looked from Calder's stone-cold face to Ida's unreadable expression. He saw the $10, a sum that could solve a lot of his own problems, and he made a decision. "Sold," the sheriff grunted, snatching the money before Calder could change his mind. "To the quiet man in the back. She's your problem now." Calder didn't say a word. He didn't grab Ida's arm or bark an order. He simply offered her his hand to help her down from the stage. His touch was firm, steady, not rough, but not gentle either. It was neutral. The hand of a man moving a piece on a chessboard. Ida hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hand was swallowed in his. She stepped off the stage, leaving the humiliation behind her, and walked with him out of the saloon. The whispers followed them out the door. No one understood. Outside, the sun was a brutal, blinding hammer. Calder untied a mule from the hitching post. He didn't look at her. He just held out the reins. "You can ride if you'd like," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Or walk, if that feels better." No one had asked Ida what felt better in a long, long time. The question was so foreign, it almost didn't register. She chose to walk. And so he walked too. Side by side, they left the town behind, a cloud of dust rising with every step. 5 miles of dry prairie separated the town from his ranch. 5 miles of suffocating silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was tense, charged with unspoken questions. Ida had been bought. She knew what that usually meant. She steeled herself for what was to come, for the demands, for the payment he would surely expect for his $10 investment. But he asked for nothing. He said nothing. He just walked. His ranch was modest. A small 2-room house, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a porch that creaked under his weight. It was clean, though. Almost unnaturally so. Not a speck of dust on the windowsills, not a stray tool left out in the yard. It felt less like a home and more like a place where someone was waiting. He opened the front door and stepped back, holding it for her. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon, not her face. "The barn's yours if you want quiet. The couch if it's warmer." The couch, inside his house. The offer hung in the air, a test. She looked at him, trying to read the unreadable. A man pays $10 for a woman, brings her to his isolated home, and offers her the couch? It didn't add up. Nothing about this man added up. "I won't be where you are," he added as if hearing her thoughts. "Not unless you say so." That was the line that broke through her fear. He'd bought her, but he spoke to her as if she still owned herself. It was a contradiction that was both terrifying and deeply compelling. She chose the barn, not because she feared him, exactly, but because the barn felt safer. Solitude was a language her bones understood. He nodded once, his expression unchanging. He brought her 2 thick wool blankets, a clean lamp filled with oil, and a biscuit wrapped in a cloth. He set them down on a hay bale, didn't linger, didn't ask for thanks, and then he was gone. Ida sat in the dark, the scent of hay and old wood filling her lungs. She ate the biscuit slowly. It was tasteless, dry, but it was food she didn't have to beg for. She wrapped herself in the blankets. They were heavy and they smelled faintly of cedar and something else. Something like old grief. She tried to sleep, but her mind was racing. Who was this man, Calder Reese? Was he a saint? A fool? Or something far more dangerous? Why purchase a woman he had no intention of using? What was his game? Around midnight, a sound jolted her awake. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was a scraping sound, coming from directly beneath her, from under the floorboards of the barn. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. She held her breath, listening. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scrape. Scrap. Pause. Scrap. It sounded like metal on dirt, like someone was digging. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was Calder in the house? Or was he out here in the dark, digging a grave? Was she the next thing he planned to bury on this strange, silent ranch? She crept to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. The main house was dark, not a single light on. The porch was empty. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a different sound, a soft, muffled thump, and then a whisper. So faint she thought she'd imagined it. A child's voice, or maybe a woman's. She couldn't be sure. She backed away from the wall, her hands trembling. This wasn't a place of kindness. This was a place of secrets. Calder Reese hadn't saved her. He had brought her to a cage, and she was beginning to realize she wasn't the only one trapped here. What kind of man buys a woman just to give her a bed in a barn? And what kind of secrets was he hiding under the very ground she was sleeping on? The morning came, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray. Ida hadn't slept a wink. Every creak of the old barn, every rustle of the wind had sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. The digging sounds had stopped around dawn, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. She expected Calder to come for her. She expected the door to swing open and for the charade of kindness to be over. But it didn't happen. Instead, she found a pot of hot coffee and a tin plate with 2 hard-boiled eggs sitting just outside the barn door. No note, just the steam curling up from the coffee like a silent invitation. Her stomach growled. Fear was a powerful thing, but hunger was older, more persistent. She ate the eggs quickly, her eyes darting around the empty yard. Calder was nowhere to be seen. The silence was absolute. Driven by a desperate need for answers, she knew she couldn't just wait. She had to know what was under the floor. After forcing down the last of the coffee, she began her search. The barn was filled with old tools, hay bales, and forgotten junk. In the far corner, half hidden under a stack of rotting burlap sacks, she saw it. A section of the floorboards looked different. The wood was newer, the nails less rusted. It was a patch, a cover-up. Her hands shook as she pulled the sacks away. Using the sharp end of an old hoe, she wedged it into the crack between the boards in pride. The wood groaned in protest. It was heavy. With a final desperate heave, she lifted the makeshift trapdoor. The smell hit her first. Damp earth, mold, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet. The smell of old blood. She peered into the darkness below. It was a small, hand-dug cellar, no bigger than a coffin, and at the bottom, nestled in the dirt, was a small leather-bound book, a diary. Beside it lay a single, horrifying object, a child's boot. It was tiny, meant for a boy no older than 5 or 6. It was caked in mud, the leather cracked and worn. But the most chilling detail was the dark stain that covered the toe, a stain that could only be one thing. With trembling fingers, she reached down and picked up the diary. The cover was embossed with a single initial, S. She opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine. The first few entries were mundane. Notes about the weather, the price of feed, a new recipe for cornbread. But as she flipped through the pages, the tone began to change. Calder worries too much, one entry read. He sees shadows where there is only sun. He says the town is not safe for me. I told him he's being foolish. This is our home. A few weeks later, the entries grew more frantic. Bernie Cobb was in town today. He looked at me again. That same look, like I am something he wants to own. I told Calder, and the look in his eyes, it scared me more than Bernie's. It was so cold, so full of rage. He said he would handle it. He said he would protect me, always. Ada's blood ran cold. Bernie Cobb. She remembered that name. He was one of the men at the auction, one of the loudest, cruelest voices in the crowd, the man who had bid a penny for her. He had tried to buy her. She flipped to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. He knows. Bernie's brother found out about the money. He came to the house last night. Calder wasn't here. He said I belonged to them now. He said if Calder didn't pay, they would take me. I locked the door, but he just laughed. He said there are no locks strong enough to keep him out. Calder is coming back tonight. He is bringing the shotgun. He told me to hide in the cellar if they come back. He said no matter what I hear, I am not to come out. God help us. God help my sweet boy. The entry was dated 5 years ago. It was the last one. The rest of the pages were blank. Ada slammed the diary shut. Her mind was reeling. S's, Sarah. Calder had a wife, a son, and they had been terrorized by Bernie Cobb and his brother. Calder had gotten a shotgun, and the diary stopped. Suddenly, the pieces started clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The quiet rancher, the town that feared him, the cellar under the barn, the child's boot, the smell of old blood. Calder hadn't just been protecting his wife. He had taken revenge. That digging she heard last night, he wasn't digging a new grave. He was checking on an old one. She was living in the house of a murderer, a man who had killed for his family and buried the evidence beneath her feet. And now he had brought her here. Why? As a replacement, as another secret to bury when he was done with her? A floorboard creaked on the porch of the main house. She looked up, her heart stopping in her chest. Calder was standing there. He was holding an axe, its blade glinting in the morning sun, and he was staring directly at the barn, directly at her. He knew. He knew she had found his secret. His face was a mask of cold, quiet fury. He took a step off the porch, the axe held loosely in his hand. Then another. He was coming for her. There was nowhere to run. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the barn and the house. Ada's breath was trapped in her lungs, a painful, burning knot. Calder walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. The axe in his hand wasn't for chopping wood. It was a statement, a final, terrifying answer to all her questions. She scrambled backwards, away from the open cellar, her hands scrabbling in the dirt. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen, turned to lead. She thought of the diary, of Sarah's fear, of the child's boot. This was how it ended for them. This was how it would end for her. He stopped just a few feet away, the shadow of his body falling over her. He looked down, not at her, but at the open trap door, the diary, and the little boot lying in the dirt. His face was unreadable, carved from granite. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ada found her voice, a ragged, desperate whisper. "Who was she? Sarah. Was she your wife?" Calder's eyes, cold as a winter river, finally met hers. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "She was." "And the boy?" Ada choked out, gesturing towards the boot. "Your son." A flicker of something, pain, rage, she couldn't tell, crossed his face. "Yes." "What did you do to them?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. "What did you do to the Cobbs?" He took another step closer, raising the axe slightly. Ada flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. But it never came. Instead, she heard a heavy thud. She opened her eyes. Calder had dropped the axe. It lay in the dirt between them. He sank to his knees, his broad shoulders slumping, the cold mask on his face finally cracking. The man who had seemed like a monster just seconds before now looked broken. "I didn't kill them," he said, his voice raw with a grief so profound it seemed to shake the very ground. "I couldn't save them." Ada stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't the confession of a killer. It was the lament of a man who had lost everything. "Bernie Cobb and his brother, they ran this town," Calder began, his voice barely a whisper. "They were leeches, bleeding everyone dry. The sheriff, the mayor, they were all on the Cobb's payroll. When I married Sarah, we had a bit of money saved. Not much, but enough. The Cobbs found out. They wanted it. They started threatening her, following her." He picked up the small boot, cradling it in his large calloused hands. "My boy, Daniel. He was 6. The night she wrote that last entry, I'd gone to a neighboring county to try and get the law involved, to find someone the Cobbs couldn't buy. When I came back, the house was on fire." His voice broke. It was already too late. The whole place was engulfed. The neighbors were just standing there watching, too scared of the Cobbs to help. I ran inside, I tried, but the smoke, the heat, I found them, together, in Daniel's room. She had been holding him. Tears streamed down his face now, silent and devastating. "The fire was ruled an accident, faulty chimney. The sheriff made sure of it. But I knew. Everyone knew. The Cobbs said it. They murdered my family because I wouldn't give them what they wanted." Ada's terror was replaced by a wave of cold, sickening pity. The cellar wasn't a grave. It was a shrine, a place where he kept the only things he had left of them. The digging she heard. He wasn't burying anything. He was talking to them, whispering to the ghosts that haunted this ranch. "But the town," Ada said, her mind struggling to process the truth. "They seem afraid of you." Calder let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "They are. After the fire, I changed. The man who loved this town died with his family. I went to Bernie. I didn't have a shotgun. I just had my hands. I beat him within an inch of his life. I told him if he ever came near my land again, I would finish the job. I told him I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man in the world." It all made sense. The fear, the isolation. Calder wasn't the town's monster. He was its boogeyman. A walking, breathing reminder of what happens when you push a good man too far. The townsfolk weren't afraid he would hurt them. They were afraid of the violence he was capable of, a violence they had created through their own cowardice. "The night of the auction," Ada began, finally understanding. "I saw Bernie in that crowd," Calder said, his eyes hardening again. "I saw him laughing, bidding on you. I saw him looking at you with that same look he used to give Sarah, that look of ownership, and something inside me just snapped. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't stand by and watch another person be destroyed by them while this whole town did nothing." He hadn't bought her as a replacement. He hadn't bought her as a possession. He had bought her to save her from the same man who had destroyed his entire world. The $10 wasn't a purchase price, it was an act of war. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, desperate for her to understand. I brought you here to keep you safe. I offered you the barn because I didn't know how to be around people anymore. I don't know how to be anything other than the ghost that haunts this ranch. Ada looked from the broken man kneeling in the dirt to the small house that had once been filled with love and laughter. She looked at the tiny boot in his hands, and she realized the truth was so much more complicated and tragic than she could have ever imagined. She had been sold as a joke, bought by a ghost and brought to a graveyard, and the man who had murdered her savior's family was still out there, walking free, laughing, and he knew where she was. What happens when you realize the man you thought was your captor is actually your protector? And what do you do when you know his enemy is now yours too? The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Ada looked at Calder, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes, the permanent slump of his shoulders. He wasn't a monster. He was a monument to loss. Slowly, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, coiled like a spring. He flinched at her touch as if he'd forgotten what human contact felt like. I'm not afraid of you, Calder, she said, her voice quiet but steady. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. For 5 years, he had been an object of fear and superstition. Kindness was a language he no longer recognized. They sat there for a long time, in the shadow of the barn, the terrible secrets of the cellar laid bare between them. He told her more about Sarah, about her laugh, about the way she'd hum while she gardened. He talked about Daniel, a boy who loved frogs and was terrified of thunderstorms. He spoke of them not as ghosts, but as living, breathing people who had been stolen from him. And Ada listened. She had spent a lifetime being ignored, being treated as if her presence was an inconvenience. But here, in this place of sorrow, her presence was a comfort. She was a witness to his pain, and in a strange way it made her feel necessary. The days that followed were different. The tense silence was replaced by a quiet understanding. Ada moved from the barn to the small guest room in the house. It was Sarah's sewing room, and some of her things were still there. A spool of thread, a half-finished quilt. It didn't feel like sleeping in a ghost room. It felt like being welcomed into a memory. Ada began to cook, real meals, stews and fresh bread. She found Sarah's old garden, overgrown with weeds, and started tending to it, her hands finding a long-forgotten solace in the soil. Calder would watch her sometimes from the porch, a silent, solitary figure. He rarely spoke, but he didn't have to. His presence was a quiet thank you. One afternoon, she found a small, hand-carved rocking chair tucked away in the barn, covered in a dusty sheet. It was beautifully made, but the wood was splintered in one spot, as if it had been thrown in anger. She spent 3 days sanding it down, rubbing it with oil until the grain shone like new. When Calder saw it sitting on the porch that evening, he stopped dead in his tracks. That was hers, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I made it for her when she was pregnant with Daniel. I know, Etta said softly. I think she'd want someone to use it. That night, for the first time, they sat on the porch together as the sun went down. Ida in Sarah's rocking chair, Calder in his own. They didn't speak. They just watched the colors of the sky bleed from orange to purple, listening to the crickets begin their nightly song. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. But peace, Ida knew, was a luxury, and their peace was shattered a week later. A rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust. As he got closer, Etta's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. She recognized the arrogant slump of his shoulders, the cruel set of his jaw. It was Bernie Cobb. He rode right into the yard as if he owned the place, a greasy smirk plastered on his face. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the tidy garden, the clean porch, and finally landing on Ida. Well, well, he drawled, his voice dripping with venom. Look what the ghost dragged in. You landed on your feet, I see. Calder stepped out of the house, placing himself between Bernie and Ida. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was enough. You're not welcome here, Cobb. Bernie laughed, a nasty grating sound. Oh, I think I am. See, I've been thinking. This is a nice little setup you got here. A nice little replacement wife. He leered at Ida. But this land is wasted on a man like you. A man who lives with ghosts. He took a step closer. I hear things, Reese. I hear the sheriff is getting pressure from the territorial marshal about that accidental fire 5 years ago. An unsolved case. They might come sniffing around, asking questions you don't want to answer. It was a threat, plain and simple. Bernie was tightening the noose. What do you want? Calder asked, his voice dangerously low. This ranch, Bernie said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. You sign the deed over to me. You and your woman, you disappear. In return, I make sure the marshal loses interest. I make sure the story of the fire stays buried, along with your family. It was the ultimate insult, to demand the very land where Calder's family was buried as payment for their murder. Ida watched Calder's hands clench into fists. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. The killer she had once feared him to be was bubbling just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. Bernie saw it too, and he took a nervous step back. But before Calder could move, before the violence could explode, Ida did something no one expected. She stepped out from behind Calder, her face calm, her voice clear. No, she said. Bernie looked at her, his smirk returning. This ain't your business, you old cow. You're wrong, Ida said, taking another step forward. She was no longer the silent, humiliated woman from the auction block. The past few weeks had rekindled a fire inside her she thought had long been extinguished. You see, Mr. Cobb, you made a mistake. You think he's the one you have to worry about. She looked back at Calder, then turned her gaze, cold as ice, back to Bernie. You think he's the one with nothing left to lose. She walked right past Bernie, untied his horse from the post, and slapped it hard on the rump. The horse bolted, galloping off toward the hills. Bernie stared after his horse, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. He turned back to Ida, his face turning a blotchy red with rage. You'll regret that. The only thing I regret, Ida said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, is that it took me 52 years to learn that bullies are just cowards in loud boots. Now get off this land, walk back to town, and think about what you've done. Bernie looked from Ida's defiant face to Calder's barely contained rage. For the first time, he seemed to realize he was outmatched. He was alone, unarmed, and miles from the town that he controlled through fear. He had expected to find a broken man. Instead, he had found a fortress. And Ida Mae Coburn was the one standing guard at the gate. He spat on the ground, turned, and started the long, humiliating walk back to town. As his figure shrank in the distance, Ida turned to Calder. He was staring at her, his expression one of pure awe. He had tried to protect her, but in the end, she had been the one to protect him. She had faced down his monster without throwing a single punch. But they both knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. A man like Bernie Cobb didn't just accept defeat, he would be back, and next time, he wouldn't come alone. The long walk back to town gave Bernie Cobb plenty of time to let his humiliation curdle into pure, unadulterated rage. He had been dismissed by a woman he'd considered less than human. The story would be all over town by morning. Bernie Cobb, the man who ran the valley, sent packing by the fat lady from the auction. His power, his entire identity, was built on a foundation of fear, and Ida Mae Coburn had just taken a sledgehammer to it. Back at the ranch, a new kind of tension settled in. It wasn't fear of each other anymore. It was the shared dread of what was coming. They knew Bernie would retaliate. It was only a matter of when and how. We have to leave, Calder said that night, his voice heavy. He'll come back with men. He'll burn this place to the ground, just like he did before. Ida was staring out the window towards the distant flickering lights of the town. No, she said softly. Running is what he wants. It's what you've been doing for 5 years, Calder. Not by leaving, but by hiding here. By letting him hold this town hostage with your secret. It's not my secret to tell, Calder argued. It's the town's cowardice. They chose to believe his lies. They chose to be afraid. Maybe, Ida said, turning to face him. Or maybe no one ever gave them a reason to be brave. They stood by and watched me be sold like livestock because they were scared. They stood by and watched your family die because they were scared. Fear is a disease, Calder, and it's about to kill that whole town unless someone delivers the cure. He looked at her, a dawning realization in his eyes. He had seen her as someone to protect, a fragile thing he'd rescued from the wolves. But he was wrong. She wasn't fragile. She was forged steel, tempered in a fire of hardship he could only imagine. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting we stop waiting for the war to come to us," she said, her eyes glinting with a fierce intelligence. "It's time we take it to him." The next morning, before the sun had even crested the hills, Ida was on Calder's mule, riding towards town. Calder had wanted to go with her, to protect her, but she had refused. "This isn't something a gun can fix," she told him. "This is about changing hearts. And that's not your fight. It's mine." She didn't go to the sheriff. She knew he was a lost cause, a puppet whose strings were pulled by Bernie Cobb. Instead, she went to the one place Bernie's influence couldn't easily reach, the women of the town. Her first stop was the mayor's wife, a woman named Martha, who had watched the auction with a pained look on her face, but had done nothing. Ida knocked on her back door. Martha answered, her eyes wide with shock. "Mrs. Coburn," she stammered, "what are you doing here?" "I've come to talk about fear," Ida said simply. She then told Martha everything, about Sarah and Daniel, about the fire, about how Bernie had been using Calder's tragedy to poison the town for 5 long years. She spoke calmly, without anger or accusation. She just told the truth. Next, she went to the preacher's wife, then the blacksmith's wife, to every woman who had stood by and let cruelty happen because they were afraid to speak up. With each telling, the story grew stronger. It wasn't just Calder's story anymore. It was their story. It was the story of their silence, their complicity. Her last stop was the saloon. It was early, and the only person inside was the owner's wife, a hard-faced woman named Beatrice who was scrubbing the floors. Beatrice had been at the auction, laughing with the rest of them. "Get out!" Beatrice snapped when she saw Ida. "We don't want your kind here." Ida stood her ground. "I was sold in this room," she said, her voice echoing in the empty saloon. "I was called a pig, a sow, and you let it happen. Your husband took the sheriff's money and let it happen." Beatrice stopped scrubbing. "What do you want? An apology?" "No," Ida said. "I want to offer you a choice. You can keep scrubbing the floors of a saloon owned by a coward who answers to Bernie Cobb, or you can help me clean up this whole town." She told the story one last time. When she was finished, Beatrice was leaning on her mop, tears silently tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She had known Sarah. They had been friends as girls. By midday, a quiet revolution was brewing in the town. The women, armed with the truth, were talking to their husbands. The story spread like wildfire, from the general store to the smithy, whispered over fences and in darkened stables. For the first time in 5 years, people were talking about what really happened the night of the fire. The shame that had kept them silent for so long was finally being burned away by the harsh light of truth. Just as the sun began to set, Bernie Cobb rode back into town. But he wasn't alone. He had 3 hired thugs with him, rough men with guns on their hips. He was done with threats. He was here to take what he wanted. He rode straight to the center of town, expecting to find a terrified populace that would scurry into their homes at the sight of him. But that's not what he found. Instead, the entire town was standing in the main street, not yelling, not holding weapons, just standing, silent, watching him. The mayor was there, the blacksmith, the preacher, and in front of them all, standing shoulder to shoulder, were the women, Martha, Beatrice, and dozens of others. Bernie's smirk faltered. This wasn't the reception he'd expected. "What is this?" he snarled. The sheriff stepped forward, his face pale. He looked at Bernie, then at the faces of his neighbors. He saw their resolve, their newfound strength, and for the first time in 5 years, he made a choice. He unpinned the tin star from his chest and dropped it in the dust. "It's over, Bernie," the sheriff said, his voice shaking but clear. "We're done being afraid of you." Bernie's face twisted in a mask of fury. You think these women and old men can stop me? He screeched, reaching for his gun. They don't have to. A low voice rumbled from the end of the street. Everyone turned. Calder Reese was walking towards them, out of the fading sunlight. He wasn't armed. His hands were empty at his sides. He walked past the townsfolk, his eyes locked on Bernie. He stopped right in front of him. This has always been between you and me, Bernie, Calder said, his voice calm. You took my family. You took my life. You tried to take my home. You will not take anything else. I'll kill you, Bernie hissed, his hand hovering over his pistol. Maybe, Calder said, but you won't do it here. You won't poison this town any longer. Look around you. Your power is gone. You have nothing. Bernie's eyes darted around at the sea of cold, resolute faces. He saw no fear, no weakness to exploit, just a wall of quiet dignity. The town wasn't his anymore. He had lost. With a final desperate cry of rage, he drew his gun. But before he could aim it at Calder, a rock flew through the air and struck him hard on the wrist. He cried out in pain, the gun clattering to the dust. Everyone turned to see who had thrown it. It was Ida, standing on the porch of the general store. In her hand was the small, cracked hand mirror she'd found under Calder's porch weeks ago. The mirror is broken, Bernie, she called out, her voice ringing through the silent street. We're done looking at your ugly reflection. Bernie's hired thugs looked at each other, then at the silent crowd, and then at their unarmed, defeated employer. This wasn't the easy job they'd been paid for. They turned their horses and rode out of town without a backward glance. Bernie was alone, utterly and completely. He scrambled for his gun, but the blacksmith was there first, his foot pinning it to the ground. Defeated, shamed, and stripped of all his power, Bernie Cobb tucked his tail and ran, disappearing into the darkness like the coward he had always been. A cheer went up from the crowd. It started small, then grew, a wave of relief and triumph washing over the town. They had faced their monster, and they had won. In the middle of the celebration, Calder walked over to Ida. He stood before her, his face full of a gratitude so immense it couldn't be put into words. He had tried to save her from the world, but she had ended up saving his world from itself. You said you saw me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you did more than that, Ida Mae Coburn. You made everyone else see too. You made me see again. He reached out and took her hand. It wasn't the neutral, detached touch from the first day. It was warm. It was real. A connection forged not in a transaction, but in a shared battle for redemption. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. It was a beginning, built not on promises, but on presence. On two broken people finding a way to be whole, not by fixing each other, but by standing together so the broken pieces could finally start to mend. Not everyone has stood on an auction block, but most of us have felt judged at some point in our lives. Judged for our size, our age, for the quiet parts of ourselves the world tells us to hide. Ida wasn't rescued by a knight in shining armor. She was seen by a man drowning in his own grief, and in seeing him, she found the strength to save herself. And in doing so, she saved an entire community. Her story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the noise you make. It's about the quiet dignity you hold on to when the world is screaming at you that you're worthless. It's about having the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. What do you think? Is true courage about fighting battles with your fists, or is it about the quiet, relentless work of healing a broken community? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and you want more tales where the forgotten find their voice and the broken find their strength, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that it's never too late to stand up and reclaim your worth.